So for this little flower, we're going to do a long and short stitch, and kind of how you do this one is you're going to start in the center, just do one straight stitch down the center. And because the bottom base of this flower is quite a bit thinner as far as like how many spaces you have, so you have quite a few spaces you're going to need to fill with stitches up here, not quite as many down here. So part of the purpose of the long and short satin stitch technique is to not put all of your straight stitches all the way to the bottom. So a satin stitch is essentially stitches all in a row next to each other. Because you don't have as many spaces to use down here, we're going to stop a little bit early, kind of just tuck it in behind. So you don't see that it's stopped early, but you also don't create what I like to call a traffic jam at the base of your petal. So you can do one side. I like to do both sides of my center stitch and start there, kind of just tucking it in behind. Your length can vary. It's not a hard and fast rule as far as what length you do. And then you're just going to come back up to the top every time. So you're stitching down, coming back to the top. And then I like to do maybe a little bit longer, but not quite all the way to the bottom, because you want to cover the part that didn't make it all the way to the center. And then jumping back up to the top. And then I'm going to come all the way down, just right next to my longest middle stitch. And what you can see here happens is that at the bottom, you only have 2 stitches side by side, but at the top, you've already done your 4th stitch. So it helps keep things from looking too, like you'll get quite a bump at the center here if you try to have every stitch go all the way to the bottom. So I'm going to make this one a little bit shorter. And then you've got a bit of like a squared off edge here on the top of our petal. So what's nice here is that you won't have to do all the way down around the curve of the petal. It'll create that shape by, as you come into here, you're almost going to fill in. So I want to go beside it. You're going to fill in, and you've almost squared off your space already. A more curved floral pattern, you'll have to go down the side, kind of like tiering it. But for this squared off petal, just almost need one straight stitch along the side. And I like to do the last stitch along my edge as a long one, just to make sure that you can see that it's not shorter than the rest. This little petal will have, you see as you're covering the accent stitches, that is fine, because we will be just following a 3-stitch kind of pattern for that. So it is on your template, you can draw them on, but that's okay if you are covering them and you're worried about that. You won't need to be able to see them. They're just there as a reminder. So just doing a variation of longer and shorter. Again, as long as you keep them kind of tucked in behind the longer ones and then don't do too many short ones next to each other, you won't see. One of the things I'll point out is that I kind of missed a spot here. It looks a little bare there, and I'm going to just add a little stitch in there, because if you leave too much of a gap between your stitches, you do end up making it look a little choppier. So to add that stitch where I feel like, okay, I should have maybe had something, I'm just going to slide my needle through to find the opening, add it in, and then I'm just going to kind of fluff things up to make sure that it's all smooth and even. And then when you're starting on your next petal, you're going to start in the center again. I like to start in the center because it just creates a nice guide for the angle of my stitches. We're doing this one with 3 strands. DMC 3866, so this is like your slightly off white. And you want to keep your stitches at the top of the petal there quite tight together. They don't have to be like, just want them about like really side by side. The further apart that they are, the more of a choppier look you're gonna get when your petal is finished. So I will say that keeping them as close together as possible does help create a more filled in, seamless edge instead of being able to see every line. This one has a bit of a that squared off, so you want to try to keep your stitches along the top as straight as possible because they are supposed to look like one continuous line there, if that makes sense. You want to keep them as even so that it's not a jagged edge here. I have a bit of a jagged edge there, and if I wanted to go back and kind of fill that in, I could. Just doing our last stitch on this side. If I wanted to kind of add one stitch right here where you can kind of see that little bit of a gap. That's one thing I do when I feel like maybe I either missed a stitch or maybe I need a little bit more to smooth things out. That just kind of creates a little bit of a stronger line there by making sure that you filled all the gaps between your stitches. I don't recommend having to go back, but if you do, it is fine. I'm going to try to even out my stitches a little bit here. I've kind of gone on a bit of an angle that I wasn't intentionally on. So I'm going to put one straight line along the edge there, and then I'm going to fill this in a bit, just so that my outside line is on the angle that I want it to. Sometimes when you're going side by side, if you've sort of goffed off kilter on your angle, it can be hard to get back. So just correcting my stitch there. I'm gonna do one more long one and then just fill in this last little gap here with our short. And then coming down into the middle. So, and if you want to sort of straighten out your stitches a little bit, you can kind of run the needle that comes with the kit is a blunter needle, so you're not gonna scratch your threads, but that's what I like the most about the tapestry needle is because they are blunt. You're not gonna rip through your threads. You can kind of do this to straighten out and kind of smooth out your stitches a little bit. Another option is kind of running your needle underneath your stitches a little bit. It's all personal. Like if you're nervous to do that, that's okay. You don't have to try it. I'm gonna have to tie off my thread pretty quickly here. So when you're coming to an end, you can stop anywhere when you run out of thread at any point in a stitch, like in a flower or a stitch. There is no right or wrong spot to need to switch your thread. If you do it correctly, you shouldn't see that you've changed your floss. I like to go when I have normally about like an inch left of floss. If I can make it to the end of maybe like a flower petal like I am right now, sometimes it's nice to do that, just for like unity and for your own flow, if that makes sense. Okay. So just turn over your, I'm going to try to show you this. You're gonna flip over to your back side. And the most seamless way to do this is to just run your thread underneath of the current stitches that you have. And as you go through your second time, so you've pushed through here, you're gonna see a loop here. This little loop that it creates as you're going under. I like to just feed my needle through that loop, creating a little bit of a knot. Depending on, most of the time I only do it once, but you can always do it 2 times. And by the time you've ran your needle under there 3 times with 2 knots, you are set. Just a little snip. All right. So then, as you can see, we're just going to jump back in and finish our last 3 petals, and then we'll move on to our center of our flower. Okay, next up we are taking DMC 310, and we're going to do this with 2 strands. So for this flower, because it's a very small little flower, we're going to start with our center and just do our satin stitch middle, and then we're going to do our accent. Oops, finger got stuck. I kind of tend to pop back and forth a little instead of sticking completely side by side. I'll sort of jump back and fill in where I didn't quite get close enough there. I'm just trying to fill in that circle as neatly as possible. We're going to have the accent stitches done after, which will be coming from the base of the petal too. So that also covers some of, oops, lost my needle. I know with black and white, it can be sometimes hard to see where I'm putting these stitches and where they're going, but you're just filling in the center. So you don't actually need to go as much to the edge, but I do find when you get to, like, say, let's just try to show you right over here on this little curved of the circle, you're just going to do a shorter and then they'll just get longer, if that makes sense. Imagining an oval, your top of your circle is going to be like a tiny little stitch versus the middle and the thickest part is going to be a little longer. I will say for mine it did end up looking a little bit more squared off than planned, but when you put in your accent stitches, a lot of the shape of your circle won't be quite as noticeable because you're going to have little black lines coming off of each, so you kind of change the shape anyway. So we're just filled in that center, and then I'm going to come up from the center of my petal and then coming down about half, just over halfway. One thing that I find is a lot of the time the top part of your stitch will get kind of lost in the threads at the top there, so it'll look shorter. So if you're wanting it, so like I went in a little higher, but and then one thing that I did there that you might have noticed is as it went down, I pulled my needle underneath of it, and I'll show you again, to make sure that my stitches were laying straight. So we're kind of following the same angle that our threads in the white followed, just giving like sort of that spread out look. You want it to follow the same shape. You don't want this one to then go straight and not follow the natural spread of the petal. So as we come down, I just want to grab my threads, kind of make sure that they're like not twisted. We want them to lay as flat as possible. So I kind of, how I do that, how I untwist them is I sort of just go in and out, pulling it back up, and they eventually will untwist. That's my kind of secret to untwisting threads. And I'm just going to do 3 right from the center of the base of each petal. The outer stitches, I'm going to do a little, like, so from the center, I'm going to do the longest one in the center, and then my shorter, a little bit shorter on the outside. That one went down nice and smooth actually, but you can see how it did kind of get, they do sometimes get a little bit buried in our white, which is fine, right? Because it's meant to sort of blend with our flower. Some of them are going to be, if you feel more comfortable coming up from the inner petal instead of the center, because your center has gotten pretty difficult to poke your needle through, that's an option too, because what will happen is the more stitches there are at the base here, it's going to be harder to find where you want your needle to come up from, if that makes sense. You might have another stitch there that feels like it's blocking you and you can't come up in the spot you want to. So my suggestion for that is going to be to come up inside the petal. Now, the only concern I have with coming up inside the petal is you can nick some of these stitches, which then pulls the thread out. Doesn't happen as much with the blunt end tapestry needle, but it is still a concern. So to avoid that, I like to try to come up from the center and then down from on the top, so that I'm pushing whatever I'm pushing it down, not up. But I do know that sometimes the center of our flower can get a little bit congested and difficult to stitch through. So if you're more comfortable going the opposite, that is an option too. Just the pros and cons of both. See how that kind of got twisted? I don't know if you can see. Got twisted, and the one part of that 2 strands isn't sitting flat, so I'm just going to pull it back up and just even out. Sometimes I'll run my thread over, or my needle over it, which then just kind of unifies those two. Okay, the next flower that we're actually going to work on is our woven wheels, and I'll talk a little bit about why I chose to do the woven wheels next. Our last flower that we'll do is this before working on our greenery, but one of the reasons that I like to do the woven wheels sort of in the middle of my work, I started with this one because there's a lot of up and down coming and I didn't want to catch my woven wheel. But if you complete this flower as well and then you try to do your woven wheel, the likelihood of kind of getting snagged on one of these two gets a lot higher. So I finished this one first to avoid it snagging this one. And then I'll start working on these two. I'm going to start down here because it's going to, if I finish this one, then I have to work on one that's stuck between two. And if this was also done, then you've got this one where you're trying to go around. And as you see when we're weaving in and out, when you were working on it, you'll see how the needle is going through and it can snag on all of these. The same with the reason that we're doing the greenery last, because the woven wheel trying to go around can sometimes snag your leaves or your flower. So we're going to work on those. But the other side of that is that you do have to end up being very careful with your woven wheels throughout the rest of your project, because what also happens is you can snag them. So just being cautious that they're there. And if you do feel like you have trouble with not snagging them, you can leave them till the end, and I'll give you some tips as we go through about how to avoid other parts, specifically this flower. So we're going to start with our lower woven wheel, and we're doing 3859, and it is a 12 strand woven wheel. And I tend to start from the center and work my way out for my spokes. So I'm just getting 12 strands on my needle, and how you're going to do that is you're going to thread your needle with all 6 strands. So you've got all 6 strands, and then you're going to pull your needle through quite a bit. You'll take the 2 ends of your thread, now that it's threaded, take the opposite end. You'll tie these 2 ends together. So you're taking this and tying this together. And then in my case, I made the tail a little too long, so I'm going to trim it up. So you've got your needle right here, and then you've got 12 strands, and it's tied at the end. And then you're just going to come up right there in between two spokes. And then I like to push up a little bit on the back of my fabric to help me get underneath of the spokes. But you just want to go over and then under. So because I came up between these two, the first thing I did was go over the first spoke and then under the next, and then over my next one and under. Whoops, got caught on my corner. So as you go around your first row around your woven wheel, I'm pulling quite snug. I like to pull snug on the first weave around. And then as I go around the rest, I just sort of pull until I can feel my thread putting in a little bit of resistance. And then I know that I've kind of hit my spot of where I need to be. So you're wrapping or weaving your thread around your woven wheel as evenly as possible. So the key to this is an even tension as you go around. If you're pulling tighter in some spots and looser in others, you're just going to have a little bit of a wonkier shape. I like to, give it a small tug if it needs to, but not trying to pull too hard, because if you do, you can kind of tangle up the rest of all of the wheel. So keeping it nice and even without pulling too tight. And the key here too is to move very slowly. It's not a race against a clock. If you don't have time, I would just suggest putting it down and coming back, because you will find most of your mistakes happen when you don't have the time. And I get a lot of questions about sort of the twisting. As you can see, it's a bit the kind of twists as you go. That's okay. It does just end up giving it a little bit of shape, like the twists and the turns, but just going really slow, letting it kind of untwist itself as it goes. If you need to, you can put your needle in and flip it, and then using your other hand, go around. It normally will work itself out. If it does stay twisted when you get to the base of your thread, you can pull it out just a little bit like this and then straighten it. So we just want to keep in mind as we're going around that when things maybe get a little bit tighter, you're avoiding snagging this flower here, or if you are working on this one here, or you've decided to wait to leave your woven wheels till the end. One of the things that I like to do, and I'll show you this, is kind of push up, which gives my needle a little bit of an upward direction, making it easier to grab it and kind of pull it out of the section where it may be snagging things, particularly like say right here, you've got your needle is flush with your fabric right now, and you're getting tighter and you're coming up and you're hitting these threads. Pushing up on the back there kind of gives your needle sort of an angular, like gives it a little bit of an angle. Then it's easier to grab it and push it up instead of it getting caught underneath of these stitches here. So you're keeping with that same tension, you're not pulling too tight as it starts to show that it's has a little bit of resistance. You want to give it that little, maybe a little tug to finish up, but then it's, and I do find a lot of the time at this point I'm using the side of my needle to kind of push up on the edge of the rows to kind of find where my spoke is. You're wanting to get to a point where you're covering the spokes, but you're not having to dig too deep to find them. So we're just gonna do one last stitch over here to cover this side so that your spokes are not visible. And then I like to do a pretty long, like if I've come up right here, I don't stitch down right next to that spot. I like to give it as if it was going around again. And then I push my needle down just kind of underneath there to finish off. And then you've got your rows, and it's not meant to be perfectly symmetrical everywhere. So if you've got like a little bit of fluff here or one piece, but I will show you, you can tie off at the back the same way. I'll just leave that hanging for a second while I show you, but you can actually take your needle and give your rows a little bit of fluffing if you want it to have some extra body, or if there's a part you find is a little bit pulled out a little bit more than the rest, you can do the same by just fluffing everything up. Kind of pushing it around and making it sit how you want it to, but just be careful with this because you can also totally ruin your woven wheel. So one of the nice things about the woven wheel is that it's not meant to be totally perfect. It's meant to be a little bit, you know, like a rose where some of the petals are a little bit more open than others, and that's okay because that's the look you're going for. So don't be too hard on yourself if yours isn't sitting exactly perfect. You can see on this one, it is a little fluffier on the one side than it is on the other, and that is totally okay. So you've got your flower all fluffed in there. Even I like to pick at it a little bit when it's not perfectly even. I can see that it's a little bit, this one came in a little bit looser than the other ones. Sometimes I'll pull on spots, which is a little bit dangerous and a little bit risky, but sometimes if I'm like, this is out further than I want it to be, I'm going to give it a little tug here, a little tug there. Sometimes it helps. That actually, I think, evened me out a little bit, and it made me, but again, like I said, it's okay to not be even. Okay, so we're going to move on to 3774, and we're going to do the exact same thing with our woven wheel. So we're going to start with our 6 strands, do our spokes, and then we're going to finish up with 12 strands for our woven wheel, and then we'll move on to our last flower. Looks like I actually went through the spoke there instead of under the spoke, which it's sitting okay, so I'm not going to mess with it, but what does sometimes happen, and you can see where I had to kind of fiddle with it, is it can get stuck and then you have to pull it out of there, and it can totally destroy your woven wheel because you're pulling, and it's hard to pull something when the entire tension of your, so that may be one where if you can't fix it, it's a restart, unfortunately. So the woven wheel is a simple stitch in the sense of you're going around on a very simple pattern, but it is a temperamental stitch. So please don't get discouraged if yours parts are difficult. Even there's parts where mine gets tangled, as you can see, and you just have to very slowly try to fix it up, just very slowly, very gently, and sometimes it has to be started again. But I find the slower you pull and the slower you move, the easier it is to catch things before they're unfixable. So if it's starting to twist like that, if I am pulling too fast and I don't stop, it'll twist to a point that I can't get it back, and it messes up the rest. So mine is very twisted right now. So I'm going to show you what I'm going to do once I get past this section. So see how I've separated the strands a little bit, and I'm pulling on one instead of both at the same time. They're not, well, I don't know if you could see that, but I'll pull on one strand instead of both, because what will happen is they're not even anymore. Like these strands are detached to each other. They're twisted up here. So I'm going to try to give you an idea of what I'm doing. I'm going to take my thread. I'm gonna put my finger over this here, and I'm gonna run my finger through my thread and kind of like straighten them out. I'm gonna try to take out all my tangles. I'm holding my finger over my woven wheel because anything that I'm pulling right now, it's then not pulling on here. So it kind of it flattens it a little bit, but it protects it from my pulling on the threads that are already inside your woven wheel. So as you can see, that helped quite a bit. I just kind of like combed through a little bit those two strands. Sometimes they get a little tangled and twisted and they're not sitting in unison anymore. They're kind of like their own wild beast, and that can cause lots of twisting. And so you can just take a second and try to untangle them a little. And there's always going to be some twisting. You're doing a circle with the thread, so of course you're going to get a bit of it, but when it gets to a point where it's unmanageable like you saw, that would be the best technique for Okay, we're going to take DMC 924 and you're going to do the same fold over method. So for this, I would say you do want to take like about an arm and a half's length. So typically when we're taking floss, I say about an arm's length, unless you know it's going to be like a really small section, and then you can take less. But for this, it's a pretty big portion of this that you're doing. So you want to take about an arm's length, but since we're doubling the floss up, I say about an arm and a half. Okay, so we've got 12 strands on our thread right now, or on our floss, on our needle, and we're just gonna pull it through starting at the top. So kind of how this one works is this is our fluffy textured flower. It's a loose satin stitch flower essentially. So you're doing a satin stitch, but you're gonna keep it loose and you're using 12 strands. So I like to pull down first, especially on that first stitch. I kind of pull it all the way through, and then I'm just going to maneuver where I want it. I'm going to get it nice and straightened out, and you're just creating kind of like a little bubble. You don't want it to be flat. You just want it to have a little bit of texture to it and create a bit of a fluff. You don't want too much, like you don't want it to be flopping around, but you do want enough. And if you hold your needle underneath while you pull, you can kind of get the perfect distance. And then I kind of like to split my section. So I might go down to like right here. And then I'm gonna go into where this meets. So you're trying to keep the right angle, and it'll twist up and it'll get all funky like that, and that's fine. You're just gonna do what we talked about on some of the other satin stitches. You're gonna pull down and you're gonna pull back up, and you're just gonna maneuver it around until you get it kind of where it is. Eventually it'll get a little bit easier, but just as you have the longer thread at the start, it's a little bit, and that's okay. So then you've kind of created these two even loops. And then I'm going to fill in this section by splitting it in half again. I find with this, it helps me to know how many stitches I need to have. If you're doing like one side by side, sometimes you end up overdoing it a little bit, especially with this loose 12 strand. You don't need as many stitches. You don't need them as close as you think you do. I have to mute myself again for this puppy. So I pulled myself down. And one of the things I'm going to do right now, because it is twisting quite a bit, is I'm going to straighten out my floss at the back, just to make sure that there's not too many twists in my actual floss, which is causing so much twisting. But again, all these things are normal as you work through starting this flower. So I'm just pulling from the back on the thread as I kind of fluff it up and straighten it out. It's not really wanting to, there we go. There we go. Okay, so now we've got, it's untwisted, it's the right depth. And then I'm gonna put maybe 2 stitches in between each of these. It just helps me figure out how many stitches I need. And one thing that I'll say is, because again, we've got a lot smaller space in the center, I'm not gonna go quite as far down. I'm gonna go almost there, but I'm just gonna pull back just a little bit so that it's not so crowded. And once you get all of your stitches in, you're not gonna see that that one is maybe slightly shorter. Just making sure that I have room for all those stitches. And see, now that we've gotten a few stitches out of the way, my stitches are sitting a lot flatter. You can kind of see I've got a guide of where to stop. Even with this one, I don't even know if I need 2 stitches between. I had to pull that one down because she was twisted. So we'll just fluff it up. And it's all filled in. Like, I don't need to do one more just to fill in the space. I think it's nice and thick and full. And so I'm gonna pop back over and finish the other half of this, what we would call kind of like a petal. And I'm just stitching to the line of the interior. The interior is gonna be black, and so we're just gonna stitch to it. Done 2 there. I'm just going to pop back up to the top, sort of where and do maybe a stitch in the center to again create my kind of guide. But we're getting a little crowded down here, so I can push these aside to kind of get a bit of a view of where I want to be. And just running your needle underneath to give yourself the even fluff, So I've put my needle underneath as kind of a stopper. It's hard to see. Stopper, and then I had pulled on the thread at the back just to get it to be right flush with the rest of my stitches. And this one, again, similar to your woven wheel, you don't need perfection. Like, you can have a little bit of, like, some of them are a little fluffier than others. That's the beauty of it, right? It's meant to be a little bit unruly, but not too much. So we're gonna start on the next section, doing the same thing. Going down into where we were, and then straightening it out. And you're just gonna follow a similar, but again, like you saw, you can adjust your fluff pretty quickly, and there's enough tension in the front and the back to kind of wiggle things out to make them all sit evenly. Where you've got the other one here, you're just gonna I'm just gonna push it a little bit to the side so that I can see, and then I'm just going in right beside it. They kind of then work together, and I've not gone too close to it where I'm covering it or making it too crowded. I think I'm gonna put one guide between here. And putting my needle through while I kind of pull from the back to make sure that I don't lose my thread in there, but I also get the tension correct. Especially when it gets a little bit more crowded, using your needle to guide you is one of the best things you can do, because then you can get that 12 strands kind of lost in there if you, look at this before it gets caught, if you are pulling it tight when it's in a section that's full like that. You might not be able to dig it out as easily as you would if it's on the side there where there's nothing else. Keep getting looped on the... There you go. And sometimes like you can look at it and be like, I could maybe add another stitch, but maybe I don't. And you can come back to it if you're like, I can see that that spot needs one more. It's harder to undo what you've overdone than it is to add what you feel like you're missing. It's okay to take a second to decide, not to rush yourself. I think I am going to put one more in there, but I wanted to give myself a second before doing it. Add one, yeah. One little guy, not quite all the way to the center, just a little filler. Go. There we go. And then I'm going to come back down here because again it helps me navigate the angle I want everything on. So the 12 strands itself creates a bit of a puff, but the needle and the loose, like running your needle under here, that's going to create the shape just as much as the number of strands and the leaving it loose. That's going to be, if you forget that step and you don't do that, you're going to notice things just don't sit as smoothly. So you're obviously being cautious of your woven wheels and trying to make sure that we're not nicking anything and kind of ruining all of our hard work. So one thing I will show you when we get particularly to this one that is like very close, if I'm coming up from the back right here, it's going to be a lot easier to nick here. So what I'll do is I'll start from my center, so where my needle is coming up. Then I have a lot more control going down and making sure that I can go down where that meets instead of coming up. And it just gives me a lot more control in not coming up accidentally through my woven wheel and messing it up. It's probably one thing that's going to give you the most not sure what I'm trying to say here. It's going to be the most effective in not damaging is when you are in those really close spots. If that needle is coming up right there, you may be more inclined to accidentally nick the flower. Just a precautionary choice to maybe come from and push down through there instead of coming up through there. Get one more in there and then we're done. So it is DMC 310 and you're also taking 12 strands. You just don't need nearly as much. So maybe like one arm's length should be enough. Okay. Okay, DMC 310. So we're gonna start in the very center. That is kind of like your meeting point for this whole part of this. And you're gonna you can either stitch into where it already is or kind of below or a little bit of both. Our first one is just kind of like our starter for each, because I kind of want each section to be somewhat even as far as how many sort of black stitches we're going to have into in each area. The areas are all a little bit different size, so that's okay too, but okay. Then what we're going to do is instead, not every stitch is going to come up from the exact center. So I'm coming just kind of beside that one, but still as much in the center as possible. Going this way, I'm just going to stitch just up. Just kind of filling in the space. And then one on the other side. And what might even be easier than coming from the middle is coming from the top. So it gives you just a bit more control around that center space that is quite congested and does have a lot going on, with most of the stitches converging there. Is that the right word? Converging. So we're gonna come up from the top, I think. It does give you a bit more control. It's hard to see with black on the videos, I do know that, but you're doing the exact same thing. You're just creating these fluffy stitches, coming through kind of where the stitches were creates a bit of an overlap. So I always like the way that looks. Some of my stitches are coming through, some of them not quite as much because I want it to still have a rounded look. So I'm trying to, you can alternate, but if you come just through in between the stitches of the blue, it's going to give a bit of like an overlapping feel, which is nice. Because obviously your petals, which are the inner petals are dark and the outer petals are the bluish color, they do overlap, right? So we're trying to make it look okay. So we've got it. So one of the things I like to do the most when I'm working with the greenery or anything where you have a lot of different spots where you're using the same color but just in different spots, I start with one shade and I'll work with that color first, and then I'll move on and finish with another color. So we're going to do something similar, and I'm going to start with some of the elements of the leaves and the greenery, and then we'll move on from color to color. We're doing all of the greenery and all of the stems in 3 strands. So you can split your strands in half and get this shade on your needle, and then we'll start working over here. And then we're going to start with the stem stitch, which can be done 2 different ways, but we're going to start with just one of those. So the stem stitch is essentially just an overlapping stitch. So we're going to come down through the fabric, and then before you close your loop, you want to come back up close to where your original, so you're backtracking just a little bit, and then you're going to close the loop, come down a full stitch, and then you're coming back a half stitch to meet up with where that stitch was, and then closing the loop. So I'm going to zoom you in just a little bit. So keeping your loop open and then coming up and then closing your loop. So these little leaves are going to have this stem stitch carry up, not quite halfway, just a little bit into the leaf, and then we'll have a color change with the leaf. So we'll come back to those. And then to finish your stem stitch, you're just going to do a stitch down to finish it. I'm going to backtrack up to here, and we'll start just kind of coming in from where you were, and I'm going to show you a second method for your stem stitch. So you're going to go down as just a regular regular stitch, and then you're going to come up as if you're going to do a back stitch, and you're going to overlap it. It's kind of hard to see with this one just because I'm right up against, but you're going to overlap your stitch. So you're doing a back stitch, but instead of meeting at your last stitch, you're actually pushing it to the side a little bit and coming down to overlap it. So hopefully you can get a good view of that. You're just pushing it to go behind. So it does the same thing, it overlaps them, but you just you come back like a back stitch instead. So this way of doing it is a tiny bit more simple. You don't need to have both your hands, but it does use a little bit more thread. I do find for a beginner it may be a little bit easier, but now you know both techniques. And if you're looking for a little bit more of a close-up of those, you can find the tutorial for the stem stitch under the level 1 stitch sampler kit, which will also help you learn every stitch there is. So I'm going back to the other technique here where you're creating kind of like a loop and then meeting back up with the I'm just going to stitch down. Okay. Finish off our last one with the overlapping back stitch technique. Kind of flip-flopping for you guys back and forth so you can see me do both. It is a little bit harder to see the back stitch version with this color and this design right now. Okay, so we finished our stems there. We do have this one up here. So I'm just gonna quickly do this stem and then we'll move on to the little flowers on here, or the little, leaves on here. And your spacing between your stitches really just depends on how tight you want like those stitches to be. If you want them a little bit longer, that's fine. They just will have maybe a little bit of a looser look if you're making them longer. Whereas the closer together your stitches are, the tighter they're gonna look. Okay, so finishing out this last one, I'm gonna stop on the back stitch. Okay, and then our next spot to do is these little leaves. So it's a leaf stitch. When you're doing it this small, it doesn't end up being as many stitches. So I'm gonna quickly show you. still follows the same technique as a leaf stitch, which we'll do for our larger leaves. It just looks a little bit different on a smaller scale. So you're coming with a straight line down the center, and then for your next stitch, you want to really like come down enough that you've created a pretty significant point. And the way this one is shaped, you want that point to be very strong. So the next stitch will go just below the first, at both the top and the bottom. And then for each side, I like to kind of meet them up, especially on these little ones where there isn't a ton of room. So my first stitch is my center one, and then the rest of them each kind of meet. So just a little bit lower than the last one, but this fifth stitch will meet up with my fourth stitch from the other side. And then I'm going to take it all the way to the stem on this one. I'd say, but these little tiny leaves, you really are only about, I want to do one more over here just to shape that side. The other side probably actually doesn't need it. So sometimes you will end on an uneven number. You might have more stitches on one side than the other, but it just depends on the shape of the leaf. I think I lost my train of thought with that. You're kind of following like an invisible line down the center of the leaf. If it makes you more comfortable, you can draw a little line down there so that you do know exactly where to follow. Okay, so right now we're going to grab DMC 3051, and I'm going to work on these green ones here. Okay, so we've got our 3 strands of 3051, and we want to keep this gray stem pretty visible, so we're just going to meet up with it for the first stitch. And then the rest of our stitches, we are going to just bud up against it, kind of underneath of it, the same way we would with a regular leaf stitch. We just have an actual little guide in the center. So you want to kind of actually go almost underneath of it so that it stays sort of visual. Don't want to like cover it. You can, for this one, I think I'm probably just going to finish one side at a time. A lot of the time for my small ones, I go back and forth. The larger leaves or different ones like this one, I think it's easier for me to just do one side of the leaf and then go back and connect with the other. Since we do have that line in the center, it's not going to matter whether our stitches meet exactly, because you won't visually be able to see that. So it's easier for me in this case to just focus on one side and then pop back to the other side after. And sometimes, like in this case where I've kind of got a few stitches to get done, I am going to use sort of the same hole until I get to, it's okay to go into the same hole from the last one if you feel like it's the right angle, if that makes sense. All right, and we're just finishing out like that. So I'm just going to keep going until I run out of thread, and then we'll move on to the larger leaves, sorry. Which again, follow the exact same technique, but just the different sizes kind of make a difference in a little bit of how you're going to approach it. And I think it's visually good to see all the different sizes. The one thing that I'll say is one of the biggest mistakes I see with the leaf stitch when people first start is that they put their stitches too far apart here. And what ends up happening is it tends to sort of look choppy there. So to keep a smooth, filled in look, if you're noticing that it looks kind of like a bunch of sharp edges, and you really notice each individual stitch, tighten your stitches up and make them a little closer together. And like I said, if you end up having to go into the same hole in the center, that's fine too, right? Like if you don't have enough stitches here and you end up having to use the same hole for some of them, that's okay. But tightening up the distance between the stitches at the top will help alleviate some of that choppiness. It'll give it a more smooth, and the stitches will look, you won't be able to tell where one ends and the other starts. So I just want to curve this out just a little bit more, so I'm going to make one more little short stitch there just so that it's not such a sharp curve. And something similar over here, adding one more. Okay. And we're almost done with this green. I'm almost out, so we'll move on. Ended up really on the inside of that line there. Just from the angle I was stitching from, that wasn't necessarily intentional. But as long as I followed the same line down, that's okay too. You will find that if you've transferred your pattern the way I transferred my pattern with a heat erasable pen, every time you transfer, you're going to have a tiny bit of a variation, because that's just natural that your hand might not draw every line exactly transferred perfectly. I mean, maybe some people, yes. My perfectionists out there might get it perfect. I personally don't always. So I do find that like every time I do a pattern, it looks just slightly different, which is not a bad thing. But just keeping that in mind, if you're looking at my transfer job versus yours, they may look a little bit different. But if you have the pre-transferred stamp, yours is going to look perfect. Okay, so here we go. We're going to do our leaf stitch. So it's the same technique we've been talking about, starting up at the top. And we're just going to come down. I'm going to say, because this one has a pretty wide base here, you're going to want to go, right through the middle, just about half. Okay. So we're going down from our center point, just enough that it creates a nice sharp tip, And then if you're looking here, you're seeing that I'm only going down just a little bit lower than where my last stitch is. I like to set my first few stitches on the tip of my leaf by working back and forth. So one side, one stitch, and meeting up. I think it keeps the consistency and it makes sure that you stay on the right track as far as even stitches, and the angle stays uneven, and oddly shaped leaves, like something like this one here, you're not gonna have to worry as much about going back and forth between starting on one side and ending on the other, but just because it won't look even on you're gonna need a different number of stitches on one side than the other. So at a certain point, you can just work, I would say the first 5 stitches at the tip to just define your top, and then you're done. And then just move on from one side. And even on this one, I think I'm getting pretty close that I'm just gonna, especially once I hit the base here, once I hit the bottom where I'm no longer matching my stitches from one side to the other, I personally will just work on one side. Okay, so now we are at where we are no longer using the back and forth method, so I'm just going to show you. So now that we're here, we still want to keep our stitches on a similar angle, the same line. So trying to keep that leaf line the same. And then as you get to this curve is where I would say it probably feels the most difficult. I like to start using the same hole. So I used the same hole as the last one I did. I'm gonna go in and do the same hole again, because you're wanting everything to converge into the same spot and keep, and if you're gonna start, you're gonna end up with a straight line. So that there, I've now created the curve, which all still then meets in versus going straight down. And you'll need to use the same hole to make that happen. So you're coming into the side of this flower. It's okay if you stitch right into it. It's just going to make it look like they're overlapping, right? Which is what you want. So it's okay to stitch this leaf kind of straight into and under, because it eventually will cover it. So I'm kind of pushing up so that I can see, and then I'm stitching my last little stitch right into there. And then you're done your leaves. So we've kind of gone through every leaf. I'm not going to stitch the rest. We're going to kind of take a break here, and then I'm going to move on to showing you guys how to back your hoop, and you'll see. So you've got your stem stitches done, you've got your leaf stitches done. Everything else is just repeating the same pattern we've already learned. So I'm going to let you work on that And then what we'll do is I'll switch to backing your hoop for the next part of our tutorial, and then you are finished. Erasing your heat erasable lines and then backing your hoop.